Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take massive amounts of research and distill it down into the core knowledge you need to be truly informed.
Today, we are taking a fascinating journey back to the 18th century. We're exploring the life of a man who, really, he achieved a singular, staggering feat. He gave the natural world a universal, consistent language.
We are diving deep into Carl Linnaeus, or Carl von Linné, after he was ennobled, a Swedish polymath who was revered by his contemporaries. I mean, they gave him these extraordinary titles.
Oh, absolutely. Titles like Princeps Botanicorum, the Prince of Botanists, and even the Pliny of the North.
And you probably know him as the father of modern taxonomy. But that title, it barely scratches the surface of his ambition, doesn't it?
Not at all. He didn't just catalog life. He organized the very structure of biological communication that every scientist on Earth uses, even today.
So our mission for you today is to give you a clear shortcut. We're going to go far beyond that dusty textbook summary of, binomial nomenclature.
We're digging into the dramatic biography, the near-miss career as a cobbler, the really dangerous expeditions, the high-stakes controversies, and this explosive 3-year period that just transformed him.
From this obscure Swedish curate's son into a defining figure of the Enlightenment. And this was all before his death in 1778.
The source material really paints a picture of a man driven by an almost frantic, relentless need to impose order on chaos. And you can see that foundational connection to nature literally encoded in his family name.
It's one of those perfect biographical details you almost wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
Before Linnaeus, his family used the traditional Scandinavian patronymic system names, like son of Nils.
Right. But when his father, Nils Ingemarsson, enrolled at Lund University, he needed a permanent family surname.
So Nils looked around the family homestead in Småland.
Exactly. And on that property stood this massive, distinctive linden tree. The Swedish word for linden is lind, and from that, he just derived the Latinate surname Linnaeus.
So the family's identity was literally rooted in a tree.
It's the perfect foreshadowing for Carl's destiny, right from the very beginning.
Okay, let's unpack this. That botanical connection wasn't just in the name, was it? It seems to have defined his entire, very curious childhood.
It really did. If we look at his first 2 decades, despite coming from this long line of peasants and priests, his path was anything but predetermined.
Carl Nilsson Linnaeus was born in 1707 in Roskilde, a small village in Småland, Sweden. His father, Nils, was a Lutheran minister, but also a serious amateur botanist.
And he maintained a significant garden. So from infancy, Carl was just constantly exposed to the world of flora.
And that exposure was incredibly personal. There's this genuinely touching detail in the sources.
Oh, the story about him as a child. Yeah, by all accounts, he was a difficult or, temperamental child, prone to fits of upset.
But his mood could be calmed immediately and completely if he was simply given a flower.
It sounds almost mythological, doesn't it? But it confirms this almost therapeutic, obsessive connection he had to plants years and years before he understood their scientific function.
And his father encouraged it. He gave him his own small patch of earth to cultivate, labeling the plants, teaching Carl their name.
He did, but that love for botany, unfortunately, did not translate to success in the classroom. Not at all.
Quite the opposite. When he was sent to the lower grammar school at Växjö, he was apparently an absolute disaster at traditional studies, Latin, rhetoric, theology.
He just preferred to be absent. He'd be wandering the fields and forests, collecting specimens, rather than, focusing on his lessons.
And this created a genuine academic crisis.
A huge crisis. His teachers were so deeply critical of his performance, suggesting he was utterly incapable of becoming a scholar, that his father, Nils, made a really drastic decision.
He was ready to pull him out of school entirely.
The plan was to apprentice the boy to an honest cobbler. At least that was a respectable, guaranteed trade.
Think about that for a moment. The man who would literally name every species on the planet nearly ended up fixing shoes.
It's wild. It's just wild how close the scientific world came to losing his contribution.
So what saved him? It wasn't the academic system. It was a mentor, a man named Johann Rothman.
Right. Rothman was the state doctor of Småland and also taught at the Växjö Gymnasium. Crucially, he was a botanist himself.
So he saw past the bad grades.
He saw the potential. He recognized Carl's genuine intellectual capacity and his encyclopedic knowledge of plants, so he intervened. He started teaching him anatomy, physiology, and most importantly, botany.
And Rothman understood that to pursue botany in that era, you had to go into medicine.
It was the only way. It was the only formalized pathway to study plants and natural history professionally. So this intervention, it just fundamentally redirected the course of his life. It pulled him from the cobbler's bench and set him on the scientific path.
So following Rothman's advice, Linnaeus begins his studies at Lund University in 1727. He registers under the Latinized version of his name, Carolus Linnaeus.
And while he was there, he benefited from the tutelage of a physician named Kilian Stobaeus, who saw his thirst for knowledge and just gave him unrestricted access to his private library and his natural history collections.
But the real professional move was to Uppsala in 1728. Rothman had recommended it as the most prestigious center in Sweden for medicine and botany.
But the reality was a bit of a letdown. The key professors, Olaf Rudbeck the Younger and Lars Roberg, were aging. They had largely stopped active teaching.
So the best place in Sweden wasn't actually that great for learning.
Not at that moment. Rudbeck, in particular, was famous, but he was physically frail and just not scientifically engaged anymore. But the sources suggest this environment may have, ironically, spurred Linnaeus's creativity. He had to teach himself.
And his self-directed study led to an immediate academic triumph that just fundamentally changed his status.
It did. In 1729, he wrote a thesis, Preludia Sponsaliorum Plantarum, the prelude to the nuptials of plants.
And this was groundbreaking, right? Because it focused entirely on plant sexual reproduction.
Exactly. It established the idea that plants, just like animals, had clear sexual organs, the stamens and pistils. And this was a major philosophical break from prior botanical thought, which often, avoided discussing plant sexuality so explicitly.
It also caused a bit of a stir. I can imagine describing plants engaging in marriage was considered quite scandalous.
Oh, highly controversial. It was seen as almost immoral by some religious authorities.
Yeah.
You're introducing human sexuality into the natural world in a way that many found really inappropriate for public discussion.
But despite the scandal, or maybe because of it, it deeply impressed the aging Rudbeck.
So impressed, in fact, that Rudbeck allowed the second-year student Linnaeus to step in and start delivering public lectures on botany to the university.
That's extraordinary.
It is. He was lecturing to audiences that sometimes swelled to 300 people, just filling a vacuum left by the inactive professors. And it was during this intensive period of teaching and studying that Linnaeus really developed a deep dissatisfaction with the existing classification systems.
He saw the complexity and the arbitrariness of the older systems.
Right, like Tournefort's system.
Yeah.
And he decided he needed something simpler, more universally applicable, and purely objective.
So this is where the seed of the Linnaean system really takes root.
Exactly. He decided that the classification of plants shouldn't be based on, arbitrary things like leaf shape or fruit type, but on the simple, observable number and arrangement of the sexual organs, the stamens and pistils. This sexual system became the organizational backbone for his future monumental work, Genera Plantarum.
So once he had this theoretical framework, he needed to prove it worked in the field. And that leads to the iconic 1732 Lapland expedition, a journey that still defines his adventurous spirit.
And this was not a luxury trip. He was sort of following the ghost of Olaf Rudbeck the Younger, whose own Lapland field work from 1695 had been tragically lost in a fire.
He secured a modest grant and set off alone.
All alone. He was often traveling in the traditional leather boots and clothes of the Sami people. It was a 6-month grueling endeavor.
Over 2,000 kilometers by foot and horse, across this unforgiving terrain of northern Sweden.
And his mission was huge. Record new flora, fauna, minerals, and meticulously document the customs and daily life of the native Sami population. He was viewing them through the lens of a meticulous ethnographic observer.
The documents from this trip give us such a deep insight into his mind.
Absolutely. He traveled with his journal, meticulously drawing and making notes, carrying large quantities of paper for pressing and preserving plant specimens. He often slept under the open sky. He was testing his system against the raw wilderness.
And the journey yielded a discovery that became intensely personal for him. Near Gevel, he stumbled upon the delicate twin flower,
Campanula serpillifolia. It was a discovery he really cherished. Years later, his friend Johann Frederick Gronovius named the genus Linnea in his honor, specifically Linnea borealis.
the twin flower. 2 small pink bells dangling from a thread-like stalk.
It was a perfect, modest symbol for the man who saw elegance and simplicity. It became his personal emblem, appearing on portraits and even on his coat of arms later in life.
And all the observations he gathered, they formed the basis of his Flora Lapponica.
They did. The Flora Lapponica was published later, describing 534 species, and it was a landmark document. It wasn't just a list, it was the first time he had truly implemented his classification ideas on a large scale.
So it's correctly viewed as the first proto-modern flora.
Yes, because it demonstrated how his organized system could bring clarity to regional biology. But the truly transformative moment, the insight that elevated him beyond just being a botanist, it didn't come from a flower.
No, it came from something far more mundane, yet so profoundly revealing.
This is where it gets really interesting. While traveling, he finds the lower jawbone of a horse lying on the road.
And instead of just dismissing it, he stops.
He stops and analyzes it with his systematic mind. He realizes that if he could observe and catalog key structural features, specifically the number and kind of teeth, and later the placement of teats, he could extrapolate a perfectly natural system for the arrangement of all quadrupeds.
So the revelation wasn't just for plants, it was universal.
Exactly. He realized his organizational principles could apply to the entire animal kingdom. This set him up for that dramatic leap into zoology that we find in Systema Naturae. This single moment on the road confirmed his belief that anatomical details, no matter how small, held the key to organizing the whole world.
Okay, so by 1735, Linnaeus desperately needs a medical degree. Not just for professional legitimacy, but also to get patronage, because Sweden was still pretty scientifically isolated.
So he travels to the Dutch Republic, which was the European hub for natural history, libraries, advanced publishing, everything he needed.
But the journey itself started with an incredible and almost disastrous anecdote in Hamburg.
The famous Hamburg Hydra incident. Linnaeus stops in Hamburg and he's shown what was being marketed as a 7-headed hydra allegedly captured in Africa.
And the mayor who owned it was planning to sell it for a massive sum of money.
Right, potentially to an emperor. But Linnaeus, guided by this fierce dedication to observable truth, he takes one look at the specimen and immediately exposes it as a crude fake.
How did he know?
He pointed out that the heads were actually cobbled together from weasel jaws and paws and then stitched onto snake skins. He even suggested the fraud might have been created by monks to depict the beast of Revelation.
So his scientific integrity completely torpedoed the mayor's scheme.
It did. By making his findings public, he endangered himself and his traveling companion. They had to flee Hamburg very quickly to avoid reprisal. It just showcases his relentless commitment to objective observation. He prioritized truth over personal safety or wealth.
Once he reached the Netherlands, he moved with lightning speed. He gets his medical doctorate at the University of Harderwijk in just 2 weeks.
That speed was possible because Harderwijk, unlike Leiden or Utrecht, allowed candidates to submit a pre-written thesis. His thesis was on intermittent fevers, what we now know as malaria.
And he correctly linked the disease to areas with clay-rich soils and stagnant water, which was an important habitat observation. He just missed the vector, the mosquito.
He missed the mosquito, but he did include this incredibly prescient observation about treatment. He proposed using Artemisia annua, or wormwood, as a possible treatment.
Centuries later, artemisinin, derived from that very plant, became a central pillar of modern anti-malarial medicine.
An astonishing piece of insight based on plant knowledge alone.
And that same summer, he reconnected with his Uppsala friend, Peter Artedi, with whom he'd made a solemn pact years earlier.
A pact that stated if one of them died, the survivor would ensure the other's manuscript was completed and published.
And tragically, Artedi drowned in an Amsterdam canal just 10 weeks after their reunion.
So Linnaeus, upholding his commitment, immediately set aside his own projects to finish Artedi's manuscript on the classification of fish, the Ichthyologia.
So these 3 years, 1735 to 1738, they were just this unprecedented creative burst. They defined his career because they culminated in the revolutionary publication that introduced his core system to the world, Systema Naturae.
Linnaeus arrived in the Netherlands as this, obscure Swedish student, and he left as a recognized European scientific celebrity. And that transformation was entirely driven by the profound clarity and practicality of his organizational structure.
The publication of Systema Naturae was the pivot point. How did an academic manuscript from a young Swede suddenly become a European sensation?
It was the immediate realization of its utility. In Leiden, Linnaeus met Johann Frederick Gronovius, a Dutch botanist, and showed him his manuscript. Gronovius was instantly captivated by its simplicity and offered to finance the printing himself.
Along with a Scottish doctor, Isaac Lawson.
That's right. And the first edition of Systema Naturae in 1735 is legendary. We think of these revolutionary scientific texts as massive tomes, but this was a concise, revolutionary document.
It was just 12 pages long, structured like a large chart.
But those 12 pages contained the blueprint for classifying the entire natural world, a bold three-kingdom system, and crucially, the introduction of binomial nomenclature.
And that binomial innovation is what we still use every day. But it's hard to grasp how radical it was without understanding the system it replaced.
The old system was hopelessly inefficient. It used polynomial names, these long, cumbersome Latin descriptive phrases that functioned more like brief descriptions than a simple name.
Like the example for the physalis plant.
Exactly. Before Linnaeus, a common species was named. Physalis annua ramosissima, Ramus angulosus glabris, Folius dentatus serratus.
That's a paragraph. How could you possibly communicate globally if every time you mentioned a species, you had to recite its defining traits?
You couldn't. It led to mass confusion. Different naturalists using different descriptions for the same species. Linnaeus replaced this arbitrary, unwieldy system with a simple two-part system, the generic name, followed by the specific epithet. So that paragraph-long descriptor became simply Physalis angulata.
The name became a label, not a description.
Exactly. It provided a universal, unambiguous address label for every living thing. And while he didn't invent two-word naming, the Bowland brothers had used it 200 years prior. Linnaeus was the first to formalize and apply it consistently across all biological kingdoms.
He took a sporadic practice and made it the indispensable rule.
And that cemented it into the scientific standard. You can just imagine how field naturalists and collectors embraced it. It streamlined their work immediately.
Suddenly, global scientific correspondence becomes clear.
Instantly. A collector in South America sends a specimen to London with the new binomial system, and there's zero ambiguity. It transcended language barriers and national borders.
So Linnaeus' fame, once launched by Systema Naturae, it needed financial fuel. And this came in the form of a crucial patron, George Clifford III.
Clifford was a titan of commerce, a director of the Dutch East India Company, and critically for Linnaeus, the owner of one of Europe's most spectacular botanical gardens at his estate, Hartecamp.
And he invites Linnaeus to be his personal physician and superintendent of his garden.
From 1735 to 1738, a period Linnaeus often cited as the high point of his life.
What made Hartecamp so special?
It was a collector's dream. Clifford maintained 4 enormous glass houses filled with exotic plants from the trade routes of the East India Company. Linnaeus was given full reign over these thousands of plants, allowing him to test his system on this overwhelming diversity of foreign life.
He called it the happiest time of my life. And it was certainly productive. He completed Hortus Cliffortianus, a detailed catalog of Clifford's holdings, in just 9 months.
That speed just confirms his organizational efficiency. In that work, he cataloged and named hundreds of species. For instance, it was here he first coined the genus name Nepenthes for the pitcher plant.
Referencing the Nepenthe, the drug of forgetfulness from Greek mythology.
Exactly. Perhaps suggesting the plant helped him forget the cares of the world, and his patronage also extended his reach. Clifford funded a trip for Linnaeus to England.
A key center for natural history. He met Sir Hans Sloane, whose collections would eventually form the basis of the British Museum.
And he also visited the Chelsea Physic Garden and met its influential keeper, Philip Miller.
But Miller was initially resistant, wasn't he? This wasn't an automatic adoption.
Not at all. Miller represented the older guard. He was skeptical of the sexual system and this new simplification. It took years of correspondence and, frankly, the undeniable evidence of the system's utility by other scientists for Miller to finally relent.
He didn't fully convert his highly influential Gardener's Dictionary until the 1768 edition.
Which just shows that even a brilliant, simpler system faced decades of institutional resistance before achieving total dominance.
So once he had the language binomial nomenclature, he needed the structure. How did he organize the staggering volume of nature into a functional, universally recognized system?
He established what we now know as Linnaean taxonomy, the nested hierarchy. This was his second crucial contribution, the blueprint for categorization that still informs modern biology.
And he started with 3 fundamental categories, or kingdoms.
Animal, plant, and mineral. For Linnaeus, the definition was based on function. The animals, animalia, live, sense, and spontaneously move. The plants, vegetabilia, live and grow. And the minerals, the paids, only grow in the sense that crystals form.
And within these kingdoms, he created the ring structure. Kingdoms divided into classes, then orders, genera, and finally species.
This hierarchical method where every species belongs to a group, which in turn belongs to a larger group. It feels intuitive now, but it was revolutionary then. It provided a comprehensive filing system based entirely on observable, shared physical characteristics.
And we still use that basic framework today.
We do. We've inserted ranks like family and phylum, and we use genetics to define relationships, but the basic idea of moving from broad categories down to specific names remains the indispensable basis of modern taxonomy.
He detailed this system across several foundational publications. After Systema Naturae, the next key text was Genera Plantarum in 1737.
This was where the sexual system really came to life. In Genera Plantarum, he defined and described 935 plant genera, grouping them into those 24 classes based purely on the number, size, and location of the stamens and pistils.
And class 24, Cryptogamia. That sounds like a rather large catch-all category.
It was, affectionately called the wastebasket taxon by some. Cryptogamia literally means concealed marriage, and it included all plants where the reproductive parts were hidden mosses, liverworts, fungi, ferns, algae.
So he just grouped them by the lack of visible sexual parts.
Right. He admitted that classifying them based on sexuality was difficult because their reproductive organs were unknown or too small to observe.
Then, in 1751, he provided the methodology handbook, Philosophia Botanica.
This was the instruction manual for the new age of botany. It wasn't just theoretical, it was intensely practical. It contained the complete elaboration of his taxonomic rules, but also offered pragmatic advice.
Like how to keep a journal and preserve specimens.
Exactly. Skills that were absolutely vital for his students who would soon be traveling the globe.
But the apex, the single most enduring document that anchors modern biology, is Species Plantarum.
Absolutely. Published in 2 volumes in 1753, Species Plantarum described and named over 7,300 species. Its importance cannot be overstated. It became the internationally accepted starting point for modern botanical nomenclature. If you want to know the valid name of a plant species, you trace it back to the name Linnaeus established in this book.
He created a universal scientific language. But the truly remarkable thing is that he accomplished this global dominance while spending the last 4 decades of his life entirely within Sweden.
His system was exported by his students. After returning to Sweden in 1738, he eventually secured his position at Uppsala University, becoming professor of medicine and later focusing on botany and the revitalization of the botanical garden. His teaching legacy became the engine of his global influence.
His lectures were immensely popular, and he encouraged his students to challenge received wisdom, even his own.
And it was this intense loyalty and shared enthusiasm that led him to nickname his most devoted pupils his apostles.
There were 17 apostles in total, and they were essential.
Linnaeus provided them with specific collection instructions, sent them off with grants, and directed them to destinations across the globe: South Africa, North America, Japan. They traveled, collected, and crucially organized their specimens strictly according to the new Linnaean system.
So the apostles didn't just collect, they validated the system in the field.
Exactly. By consistently using his binomial naming and hierarchical structure, they proved its immediate utility and helped cement Linnaean taxonomy as the global standard.
But we have to acknowledge the immense human cost. These were often solitary, dangerous expeditions.
The fatality rate among the apostles was devastating. Christopher Turnstrom, the first apostle, died of a tropical fever in 1746 on his way to China. His wife publicly blamed Linnaeus,
which reportedly led him to prefer sending younger, unmarried students in the future.
That tragedy must have weighed heavily on him. The sheer difficulty of travel was murderous. 6 other apostles died on their journeys, from disease, shipwreck, even assassination attempts.
It's important to pause and appreciate that emotional sacrifice. Linnaeus stayed safe in Uppsala, managing his garden, while his devoted students risked everything to validate and populate his system.
But the successes were transformative for science. Per Kalm's expedition to North America was highly fruitful.
He brought back material Linnaeus had never seen. I think at least 90 of the 700 North American species in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae came from him.
He was incredibly important. And then you have the apostles who sailed with James Cook. Daniel Solander, who had lived in Linnaeus's own home, accompanied Cook on the endeavor.
And Anders Sparrman followed on Cook's Resolution expedition. The fact that the naturalists on the most important scientific voyages of the era were using the Linnaean system immediately established his preeminence.
And finally, there's the incredible story of Carl Peter Thunberg, who managed to collect plants in isolationist Japan.
A master strategist. He worked through the small Dutch trading post outside Nagasaki, persuading translators to bring him specimens. It just confirmed the true global operational reach of the system.
So while the plant system was broadly accepted, Linnaeus created a firestorm of controversy when he turned his classifying eye toward the animal kingdom, particularly when he placed Homo sapiens within it.
This was a direct assault on the theological and philosophical status quo of the 18th century, which placed man on a spiritually separate plane.
Completely. In the very first 1735 edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus grouped humans, Homo, taxonomically with apes, simia, under the order he named anthropomorpha, meaning man-like.
And what was the scientific rationale for such a provocative grouping?
His reasoning was purely anatomical and morphological. He had studied specimens of monkeys and apes and noted that, when viewed purely as physical beings, the anatomy was nearly identical. He concluded that, based on observable traits, there was no objective morphological difference, save for speech.
But surely he understood the religious and philosophical weight of the human soul and reason.
He did, privately. He acknowledged that the capacity for reason and the soul were the real non-morphological distinctions, but his mission was to classify nature based on natural principles, meaning strictly observable physical traits.
And this stance led to that famous clash with the German scientist Johann Georg Millen.
That letter in 1747 remains one of the most powerful challenges to human exceptionalism of the era. Millen criticized the anthropomorpha grouping, and Linnaeus responded by demanding scientific proof.
He wrote, "I seek from you and from the whole world a generic difference between man and simian that follows from the principles of natural history. I absolutely know of none, if only someone might tell me a single one."
He effectively threw the challenge back at the critics. He said, "If you claim we are different, tell me a single observable physical characteristic that follows my system's rules."
The resulting theological conflict must have been immense. It fundamentally challenged the great chain of being.
It was perceived as a profound demotion of humanity. If man was simply an animal placed right next to monkeys, it challenged the core idea that humanity was created distinctly in the image of God.
By the time he published the landmark 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758, he shifted the terminology slightly.
He did. He replaced anthropomorpha with the order primates, first ones or chief ones, and formally gave humans the binomial name Homo sapiens, wise man.
Which was maybe less provocative, but the core grouping remained.
It remained intact, cementing the biological reality that humans are fundamentally part of the animal kingdom. And he also introduced another key concept in that edition, the class Mammalia.
Based on the presence of mammary glands. And the sources suggest this was influenced by a social campaign he was running at the time.
Right, he was a vocal advocate for maternal breastfeeding. At the time, particularly among the Swedish upper classes, it was common to use wet nurses. Linnaeus vehemently opposed this, arguing it was unnatural.
He even wrote a pamphlet, Nutrix Noverca, the stepmother nurse.
He did, and the creation of the class Mammalia, emphasizing breastfeeding, is thought to be a subtle scientific endorsement of his public health and social stance.
And it also appears the genus Homo was initially much broader than just Homo sapiens.
It was. He attempted to classify other creatures he had heard about. He added Homo troglodytes, or caveman, based on often exaggerated or mythological accounts, and Hermalar, which we now know as the Lar gibbon. He was trying to bring order to every reported description, even if the information was dubious.
Okay, so while his commitment to anatomical objectivity led to the controversial but scientifically sound grouping of primates, his attempt to subdivide Homo sapiens into varieties, this is where a deeply problematic legacy begins.
Yes, and this requires critical discussion within its historical context. In the early editions, he initially divided Homo sapiens into 4 varieties based purely on continent and skin color: European, American, Asian, and African.
But by the later editions, this changed.
It did. By the 10th edition in 1758, his descriptions expanded dramatically. He began detailing specific, subjective, phenotypical characteristics for each variety, linking them explicitly to the ancient, non-scientific concept of the 4 temperaments.
Did you give us an example of that?
Certainly. For Europaeus, white Europeans, he described them as sanguine, inventive, and governed by laws. For Americanus, red Americans, choleric and ruled by custom. For Asiaticus, yellow Asians, melancholic and governed by opinions. And for Africanus, black Africans, phlegmatic, cunning, and governed by caprice.
And he also added the infamous Homo monstrosus category.
A catch-all taxon for various groups considered wild or abnormal. Now, Linnaeus himself believed these variations resulted primarily from environmental differences, climate, diet, location.
But regardless of his personal intent.
The sources clearly show that the inclusion of subjective cultural, behavioral, and moral traits alongside physical characteristics was devastatingly influential. His attempt at classification, which prioritized skin color and temperament, formalized a racial hierarchy within a supposedly objective scientific framework.
So in essence, he lent the prestige of his scientific system to colonial stereotypes, providing a structural foundation that later pseudoscientists would exploit to justify and fuel scientific racism for generations.
Exactly. His enduring contribution is the structural framework of classification. But his application of that framework to human variation is a profound example of how cultural bias can inadvertently become encoded into a system. It really underscores the critical need for constant scrutiny in science.
Despite the scientific and social controversies, Linnaeus was celebrated in his lifetime, eventually reaching the highest echelon of professional and social achievement in Sweden.
After returning to Sweden, his career ascended rapidly. He was appointed professor of medicine at Uppsala in 1741, though he quickly exchanged roles to focus on his true love botany and managing the botanical garden, which he entirely reconstructed.
And beyond his biological work, he even left his mark on physics. He inverted the Celsius scale in 1745.
He did. When Anders Celsius initially designed his thermometer, he set the boiling point of water at 0 degrees and the freezing point at 100. Linnaeus found this inverted system unwieldy.
He argued that a higher number should logically correlate with a higher or hotter temperature.
It just made intuitive sense, so he flipped the scale to the configuration we use today, 0 degrees C for freezing and 100 degrees C for boiling, creating a much more pragmatic standard.
Honors continued to pile up. He was named chief physician by King Adolf Frederick.
And finally, the ultimate personal achievement came in 1757 when he was granted nobility by the king. This was formalized in 1761 when he officially adopted the name Carl von Linné.
His ennoblement gave him a platform to perfectly encapsulate his life's work through his coat of arms. It's incredibly symbolic.
It's a marvelous piece of self-reflection. The von Linné coat of arms prominently features his beloved twin flower, Linnea borealis. The shield itself is divided into 3 fields, red, black, and green.
Representing the 3 kingdoms of nature, he dedicated his life to classifying.
Animal, mineral, and vegetable, exactly. And the motto he chose was also a powerful statement of purpose.
Famam extender factus.
We extend our fame by our deeds. It was an ambition not reliant on title or birthright, but on the tangible, lasting impact of his scientific contribution.
As he moved toward retirement, Uppsala became too noisy and maybe unhealthy for him. In 1758, he purchased the Hammarby estate.
This move was cemented by a very real fear of loss. After a fire ravaged Uppsala and threatened his home, Linnaeus took action. In 1766, he built a dedicated stone museum on a hill at Hammarby, specifically to house his extensive library and collections.
Physically separating this priceless accumulation of knowledge from the risks of the city.
But sadly, the final years of his life were characterized by a difficult decline. They were marked by increasing infirmity. He suffered from sciatica, followed by a partially paralyzing stroke in 1774.
A second, more severe stroke in 1776 left him profoundly affected.
He had partial paralysis and this devastating level of memory loss.
It's a truly heartbreaking detail that he could still hold and admire his own published works, his species, Plantarum, or his Systema, Naturae, but could no longer recognize himself as the author.
The irony is just cruel. The mind that had organized the entire world lost the ability to organize his own identity. He passed away on January 10th, 1778, and was interred in Uppsala Cathedral.
And then the collection itself became a scientific drama, a saga that ensured its legacy but also saw it leave Sweden entirely.
Right. His son, Carl Linnaeus the Younger, inherited the whole estate. He tried to preserve the material, but he died prematurely just 5 years later, leaving the massive estate in the hands of his widow, Sarah.
This created an opportunity that a young Englishman seized.
James Edward Smith, a 24-year-old medical student, heard the collection was available. He immediately traveled to Sweden and purchased the entire lot from Sarah.
A staggering collection. 14,000 plant specimens, over 3,000 insects, 1,600 books, thousands of personal letters.
For 1,000 guineas, he effectively transported the entire foundational archive of modern taxonomy to London.
And 5 years later, Smith used this collection as the nucleus for founding the Linnean Society of London,
which ensured the collection's permanent preservation and its role in the global scientific community, albeit outside of Sweden.
So his achievements are just colossal, and his contemporaries immediately recognized the magnitude of his work.
They did. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, famously declared, "I know no greater man on earth." And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was profoundly influenced by him, stating that he knew no one other than Shakespeare and Spinoza who had influenced him more strongly.
Even poets recognize the artistry of his organization.
Yes, the Swedish author August Strindberg characterized him as a poet who happened to become a naturalist, acknowledging that his system imposed a kind of narrative order on nature.
And the respect for his system transcends time, too. There's a fascinating modern metric, a 2015 study that used the PageRank algorithm on Wikipedia data to rank historical figures by influence.
And Linnaeus came out on top, ranked as the most influential historical figure, surpassing Jesus, Aristotle, Napoleon, and Adolf Hitler. The algorithm essentially confirmed that his classification system is the single most referenced and interconnected structure in the history of science.
So what's the ultimate takeaway? Despite the controversies and the fact that modern science has tools like DNA sequencing, why does the Linnaean system remain fundamentally sound?
Because of his genius for organizational simplicity, his establishment of universally accepted conventions for naming organisms, binomial nomenclature, and the nested hierarchy, that is his main and most critical contribution. It provides a sound, consistent, practical framework for communication.
We may use genetic data to refine the relationships between species, but the basic unit of species and genus that Linnaeus formalized remains the global language.
Exactly. It ensures that any two scientists anywhere on the planet can communicate clearly about a single organism. The structure is just so effective that it transcends the changes in the underlying data.
That has been our deep dive into Carl Linnaeus. He was this force of organization who transformed a chaotic jumble of descriptive scientific names into a precise, concise, and global language.
His work enabled global exploration through his apostles and formed the very basis for modern ecological understanding.
His greatest deed was providing clarity. He managed to impose order on the almost overwhelming diversity of life, moving us from these unwieldy paragraph-long descriptors to functional two-word labels that transcend language and nationality.
He defined the rules of the game for natural history, and that framework persists because it's just inherently efficient.
And if you want to understand the man's philosophy, his ultimate respect for the perpetual nature of life, you just have to return to his coat of arms.
When he was ennobled, he chose to place a fascinating piece of symbolism right in the center of that shield, surrounded by the three kingdoms of nature. An egg.
And the motto inscribed around it explained the symbolism. To denote nature, which is continued and perpetuated in ovo.
That phrase, in ovo, within the egg, acknowledges that the sheer, continuous creative force of life is always ongoing. The order he established is ultimately rooted in the continuous cycle and renewal of life itself.
So the system is permanent, but the subjects of that system are in constant creative chaos.
Which means the task of classification is therefore never truly finished.
So as you reflect on the sheer, continuous perpetuation of nature, the things that continue to reproduce in ovo, what part of the world, left unclassified by him, do you think is next to benefit from a deeper, more Linnaean understanding? We'll leave you with that thought.